Hello and welcome back to Linux Academy. This video is all about system automation in Python using Fabric. Fabric is a Python library used for streamlining SSH application deployment or system administration. You can transparently connect to remote servers over SSH and run commands like updating the server, installing applications, checking logs, and so on. To do a basic test, let's start off by going to our server lab and starting up two servers. I'm just going to use the CentOS 7 distribution and start up two servers. We will be using the first server as our master node where we will have our Fabric script, and the second server will be the host we will be sending the commands to. First thing I need to do is log into my master server. So I'm going to SSH user add. You should use the IP address or the name of your lab server here. Let's quickly log into our master server. Next, we need to switch over to root because we will be installing packages. As you all know, when changing to root for the first time, the Linux Academy lab servers require you to change the password. Let me just clear my screen. To install Fabric, all you need to do is yum install Fabric. This process might take a minute or two, so I'm just going to fast forward through it. At a point, it's going to stop, asking you to confirm. Just hit yes. And now let's create our first Fabric script. Using a text editor, open a file called fabfile.py. First thing, let's import the modules we need to run our application. Let's do from fabric.api import sudo. This is the recommended way of importing modules where you only import the functions from a module that you need instead of importing everything. Let's create a simple function called update server, which will use the sudo command and do yum-y upgrade. This will essentially update our Linux server to the latest releases on all the packages installed. Whenever I start working on a newly built server, I always make sure that it's updated with the latest security releases. Save this file, and to simply run our script, just do fab and then update server, which is the name of the function we defined in our file. At this point, since we have not defined any hosts in our file, it'll ask us for which host to connect to. Let me go back to my server console and copy the public host name of my second server and paste it back here. The system will ask me for my password to log into that second server, and then run the command and give me the output, and finally say done disconnecting from my second server. As Fabric executed these commands on the remote server, it printed out the name of the remote server in square brackets and then the word out with all the responses it got from the server. Now let's look at a slightly bigger example. We will set up 3 web servers and 2 database servers on our Linux Academy server lab. So let's log into our server lab. As you can see, we already have one server running. That's the master server where all of our scripts are going to be. But let's set off 5 more servers. All of these are CentOS servers. And while they're coming up, let's go back to our Linux console. So let's create a new fab file. First things first, we should create a doc string up top with triple quotes documenting what this file does. So this example uses Python Fabric to deploy MySQL, MariaDB, and Apache on 5 servers. As part of this script creation, I will be putting in a lot of comments as I type in my code. Comments are going to be preceded by a £, and then what the code block is going to do. Next, I'm going to import all the Fabric functions that we explicitly need. So for example, we'll do from fabric.api import env roles sudo execute put run local lcd prompt cd and parallel. As we go through the script, you'll see how to use each one of these. Next, we'll import the OS module to get the file base names. Import OS. And you'll see that functionality here in a bit as well. Next, we have to define the group of web servers and databases. to env.roledefs equals web server. For that, let's flip over to our server lab and get the private IP addresses of our servers and put them right here. So for the web server, I have 3 IP addresses. And then for the database, I have 2 more, 172.31 and another one. The env role defs is a Python fabric construct which allows you to create groups of servers and then operate on them as one group instead of on each server separately. We're also going to define a special group called all so we can easily send out all commands to all servers if needed. To do that, we're going to just do env.roledefs all and then a Python list dictionary comprehension to get all the IP addresses from our original roledefs dictionary. Let's also set up in the dictionary the packages that are required to run our application. So do packages required, and let's say on the web server I need, we'll just create a list here, HTTPD, PHP, NTP, PHP, MySQLi. Of course, if you were doing this for your own needs, you install whatever packages that you want in whichever groups that you need to. On my database, I need MariaDB server. I'm going to also create a dictionary of files that need to be downloaded from our lab server repo. So I'm going to say download files and create a dictionary just like before. And it's for the database, let's download a couple of files. One is called Sakila, the other one's called Sakila data.sql. These are files that are provided with MySQL as dummy data. These files contain the SQL required to create our database. And then for our web server, the web pages that will be displayed. Next, we will use a decorator called roles and pass in the value database, which will make sure that the function right after this line will be run for every server in the group database, which was defined previously in the env role defs. So let's define our function install database. This is going to install our database application. Sudo, for those of you who do not know, is used to run a command on a remote server as a super user. So I do sudo yum -y install, and then I'm going to use a join to get the packages required as a list for my database. And I'm going to finish off with pty equals true. The pty equals true allows you to input a password if the sudo requires it. Next, we have to activate the MySQL MariaDB in the control. So we're going to use another sudo, do system control enable MariaDB pty equals true. Then of course we have to start it using the system control. So do sudo system control start MariaDB. Now I need to create a MySQL user on the database server. To do that, I'm going to use sudo again and pass in MySQL and some SQL to do that for me. Last thing for this function, I'm going to check the MySQL process if it's running. This example is going to show you how to run a command without being sudo. Run to ps -ef pipe grab MySQL. So that's my function to install a database. Now let's create a function to set up the database. First thing I'm going to do is use a decorator called parallel. Normally all functions are run sequentially. The decorator parallel will run the function defined beneath it on all the servers in parallel. I'm also going to use the roles decorator to make sure this runs for all databases, which we've seen before. And as you can see here, you can use multiple decorators before a function. So we do def setup database. In this function, we will use our temp directory to download some files from the internet and then run them into MySQL. Temp dir equals /temp. Now we will use the cd command to change the directory on the remote server. Using with before the cd temp dir makes sure that all the commands that are being executed within that block are being done within the temp directory. Now we're going to iterate over the files we need to download for the database. For URL in download files, put database there. That's going to give us all the files that we need to download. The URL will have the full web address of where the file is located, but what we really need right now is just the name of the file. For that, we are going to use the OS module. So we'll do file name equals, and then pass in the temp directory dot os dot path dot base name and the URL, which will just extract the name of the file. Now we need to execute the wget command on the remote server to download these files from the internet and save them to a particular file name which we've created above. To do that, just do run wget, and then we're going to pass in the URL and the file name. We are downloading SQL files, so next we need to actually dump them into MySQL on the remote server. For that, we can just call the run function, call MySQL -u root, and dump in the file name. Next, we will create another function that's going to be applied to all my web servers. Say def install my web servers. This is going to install our web server applications using sudo like before. So let's do sudo yum -y install and just give it all the packages using a join function with a space of the web server. And just like we did with the MySQL server, we have to enable and start our web server. I'm just going to use sudo to do that for both my enable the service and to start my service. And finally, we need to add some commands to SE Linux to ensure the web server can function as required. Next, I'm going to set up roles for a web server, which we know is going to run for all web servers, and set up a function called setupMyWebServer. This will be very similar to setup database, but we will download the files locally and then put them on the remote server. So first we need a location for our temp directory where to download the files locally, and then also set up the directory on the remote server. So remote dir equals var www.html. And as I've already stated, I will download the files on the master server and then put them over to the remote server so you can see that functionality. Now, since we are doing all the downloading on our master or local server, instead of CD, we are going to use LCD. Now we need to iterate over the files that we are downloading for our web server. So I can do URL in download files web server. And like before, I'm going to use the os.path.base name to extract just the name of the file. Since we need to run the commands locally on our master server, we are going to use the function local. Say local wget, and then the command to download the file on our local server. So if you were doing this on a remote server, you would use run, but on the local server, you would just use local. At this point, the files will be in your local directory, and you need to push them out to the remote server. Use the put command, give it the file name, the directory on the remote server, any permissions you want to change, and finally, if you want to run the put command as super user on the remote box to ensure you don't get hit with permissions. All of our web servers need to connect to a database in the back. So let's do database equals pick server env.roledefs database. Here shortly we will be creating the function pick server. Now using sudo, we'll create a file on the web server to tell it which database to be connecting to. Now the pick server function, which gets a list and enumerates it and asks the user to pick from it. A simple while statement that says as long as the database is greater than equal to 1 but less than equal to the length of my list, I can enumerate my variable and ask the user to select a value. And finally, the last function, we want it to be applied to all of our servers. So I'm going to use the decorator roles and pass it all. And it's a function that you've seen before, upgrade servers, just using the sudo command and doing yum -y upgrade on all the servers. Now let's create the main function to run it all. We're going to call it deploy. And then we're going to execute all of the functions that we have called before. So execute upgrade server, execute install database, execute install web server, execute setup database, and execute setup web server. Once all of those are done, just going to print out rock and roll, we are done. So let's exit out of our text editor. Now all I need to do is do fab deploy. System will ask me for a password. In this case, it's going to be the same password it's going to use for all servers. And it starts running all of our automation on all of our servers. Now this takes a long time, so I'm going to speed through it. But as you can see on the left in the square bracket, it's going to tell me the server it's running on. And finally, it'll get to a point where it'll ask me for choosing the database I want the servers to connect to. And finally, it gets done. Now I can grab the public IPs of my web servers from my server lab, paste them into my browser, and I can see all those sites are live. Now it took a little while to do this with all the typing, but once you have your fab file set up and a small change, you can deploy it to multiple servers very fast. Another thing to note here is we did enter the password every time, but if you're doing this in a production environment, you're probably better off doing keygen and do an SSH copy ID, and that way you don't need passwords for any of the servers. That's it for this video. If you have any questions, make sure to post them in the community, but for now, mark this complete and go on to the next one.